Florida beach disappears. Not slowly, not over decades, in days. And the families living on Hutchinson Island, Florida, had nowhere left to run. The ocean was already at their door. This is not a story about a hurricane. There was no hurricane. This is not a story about a flood warning. There was no warning. This is a story about a coastline that has been disappearing for years, inch by inch, tide by tide, and the moment it finally crossed the threshold that nobody could ignore. On February 8, 2026, the city of Fort Pierce declared a state of emergency. And what the data shows about why this happened and what comes next is more alarming than the emergency itself. Hutchinson Island sits off the coast of St. Lucie County on Florida's Treasure Coast. It is a barrier island, a narrow strip of sand positioned between the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Indian River Lagoon to the west. Barrier islands exist for one purpose: to absorb the energy of the ocean before it reaches the land behind them. They are not permanent structures. They are geological processes, living systems that require constant input of sand to maintain their shape and their function. Remove the input, the island shrinks. Keep removing it, the island disappears. But that entire function depends on one variable: the presence of a beach. At Jetty Park, on the southern tip of Hutchinson Island, that beach has effectively ceased to exist. Where a wide-open shoreline stood just 2 years ago, the water now reaches the foundations of private homes. One homeowner lost a 40-foot dock in a single night. His house now sits 8 feet from the waterline. 8 feet. Last Saturday night alone, he lost 8 more feet of dune and half of his dune walkover in a single tide cycle. The other half, he said, is probably near the Bahamas by now. The dune system that protected the island for decades collapsed, the natural buffer between the open Atlantic and hundreds of residential properties. Gone. And City Commissioner Michael Broderick stated the consequence directly. If the dune breaches, roads close. Saltwater enters the utility infrastructure. Properties are cut off. Flooding reaches State Road A1A. That is not a projection. That is what happens next if the embankment fails. So, how did it get here? The erosion at Fort Pierce did not begin in February 2026. The pattern runs back years, and understanding it requires looking at 2 simultaneous failures that arrived at exactly the same time. The first is geological. Florida's east coast loses sand through a natural process called longshore sediment transport. Sand drifts southward along the shoreline continuously, carried by wave energy and ocean currents. Inlets interrupt that drift. The Fort Pierce Inlet acts as a trap. Sand moving southward along the coast reaches the inlet and falls into the deeper water of the channel instead of continuing onto the beaches to the south. Without active intervention, those beaches starve. The intervention is federally funded beach nourishment. Periodic pumping of dredged sand from the inlet channel back onto the eroding shoreline to the south. It is not a permanent solution. It is a maintenance cycle, a treadmill that the coastline must stay on indefinitely or begin losing ground immediately. That brings us to the second failure, the institutional one. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers failed to secure a vendor for the scheduled nourishment cycle. The project fell a full year behind schedule. The sand that should have been on the beach in 2025 was not there. And then the winters arrived. 4 consecutive harsh winters. Cold fronts in succession. Persistent northeast winds. Extended wave action stripping the dune face at a rate that no recovery cycle could match. Andy Studd, Palm Beach County Coastal Manager, described the accumulation precisely. 4 rough winters in a row, multiple cold fronts, extended wave impact from strong, sustained winds, each front hitting a shoreline already weakened by the one before. Each season leaving less beach than the last. By February 2026, there was almost nothing left to lose. If what you are seeing right now concerns you, you are not alone. Thousands of people are realizing for the first time how fast this is actually moving. If this story matters to you, drop a comment below with what you think should happen next. It helps more people find this video and keeps this conversation going. And if you want to follow the story as it develops, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you will not miss what comes next. The emergency response that followed cost $500,000. Dump trucks running around the clock, 8 million pounds of sand deposited in 4 days. Concrete barriers installed behind private properties after officials determined portions of the dune system were on the verge of washing out entirely. Commissioner Broderick stated the operational reality without softening it. "We are just going to have to dump sand every day. Persistent high tides are dismantling the protections almost as quickly as crews can build them." After 4 days and 8 million pounds of sand, the restoration was 40 to 50% complete. The ocean was absorbing the intervention in real time. This is the detail that reveals the true scale of the problem. 8 million pounds of sand placed by heavy machinery over 4 consecutive days produced less than half the recovery needed on a single stretch of beach. The energy balance is not close. The ocean is not losing this exchange. And the emergency operation was never designed to win. It was designed to buy time. Time until the larger federal project could arrive. Time until the dune could be rebuilt to a depth that might survive the next tide cycle without immediate collapse. The Island Beach Bar and Restaurant, one of the anchor businesses on South Beach, was forced to close its popular outdoor dune bar due to safety concerns. The road outside was shut down during the day to allow dump trucks and bulldozers to access the beach. Assistant General Manager Jennifer Cranwell described the shift in the community's mood directly. "There is concern, some discouragement. The safety factor versus years past is somewhat alarming that it has gotten this bad seemingly this quickly." Seemingly this quickly. That phrase carries the weight of the entire story, because for the residents watching the ocean advance, the speed feels sudden. For the data, the speed is the result of years of accumulated loss finally becoming visible all at once. The shoreline was not stable before this winter. It was already deteriorating. This winter removed the last margin. Here is the number that reframes everything. More than 426 of Florida's 825 miles of coastline are now classified as critically eroded. That is more than half of the state's sandy beaches. The average erosion rate along the Florida Panhandle runs at nearly 1 meter per year. In isolated zones, the rate exceeds 7 meters annually, and the rate is accelerating. Sea levels around Florida have risen 8 inches since 1950. The current rate is 1 inch every 3 years, and that rate is itself accelerating. Over the next 30 years, sea level rise along the United States coastline is projected at 10 to 12 inches. That is as much as the total rise recorded across the entire previous century. The compression of that timeline is the most important number in this story. What took 100 years to happen once will happen again in 30. The annual sand requirement for beach nourishment across Florida is projected to triple by 2050. The cost of that sand is projected to rise 5-fold as global supply tightens and demand from every erosion-affected coastline simultaneously increases. The math does not close. The erosion accelerates. The intervention costs rise. The federal funding mechanism stays structurally constrained. And the Army Corps of Engineers has confirmed it will not prioritize a permanent structural solution for South Hutchinson Island because the area does not meet the federal cost-benefit ratio required for funding approval. The cost-benefit calculation that determines whether a shoreline receives permanent federal protection is built on property values, population density, and infrastructure replacement costs. South Hutchinson Island, by that metric, does not qualify. The community does not qualify. So what happens to a coastline that cannot qualify for the protection it needs? It absorbs emergency after emergency. Each operation more expensive than the last. Each intervention buying less time than the previous one. The cycle is not sustainable. The data says so. The shoreline is now confirming it with visible, measurable daily loss. The larger federal Nourishment project is a $15 million operation designed to pump 400,000 cubic yards of sand across a 1-mile stretch of Hutchinson Island. 400,000 cubic yards. That is the volume of sand required to restore 1 mile of shoreline to a functional protective depth. The emergency operation placed 3,000 cubic yards over 4 days. The scale difference between the emergency stopgap and the actual solution required is not a rounding error. It is a measure of how far behind the shoreline has fallen. That project mobilizes March 9th. Sand pumping begins March 11th. That project covers 1 mile of shoreline. The breach zone sits a quarter mile south of the jetty. Between now and March 11th, the emergency measures are the only barrier between the existing embankment and the open Atlantic. Commissioner Broderick reduced the timeline to its essential fact. It is getting worse by the hour. Every tide cycle. We are losing embankment, and there is not much left to lose. On February 18th, the state of emergency was officially ended. The commissioners voted unanimously not to extend the declaration, citing increased labor costs and a reduced operational workload. City Manager Richard Chess explained the decision. The workload no longer supports emergency pay. When sand needs replacing, Public Works goes out, it takes less than 30 minutes, and they return. Broderick agreed with the decision but stated the underlying risk plainly. We are still looking at potentially another 4 to 6 weeks before renourishment begins on South Hutchinson Island. The breach areas are a quarter mile south of the jetty. We may need to institute the emergency again at a moment's notice. The state of emergency ended. The emergency did not. What is happening at Fort Pierce in February 2026 is not an isolated event. It is what happens when years of compounding erosion, delayed federal intervention, and accelerating sea level rise converge on a single barrier island in a single winter. But the deeper problem is what sits beneath the sand. Florida's coastline is built on limestone, ancient, porous, carbonate rock laid down over millions of years, and now sitting at or near the surface beneath the thin layer of sand that gives each beach its shape. Limestone is soluble. When saltwater reaches it, it begins to dissolve. Not dramatically, not visibly, but continuously, at a chemical level, on contact. Every tide that reaches the limestone beneath Hutchinson Island is not just removing sand. It is beginning a process of structural dissolution that no nourishment project can reverse. The sand can be replaced. The limestone cannot be restored on any human timescale. This is the threshold beneath the threshold. The point at which the island stops being an eroding beach and becomes something geologically different. A structure that has lost its foundation material permanently. Fort Pierce is not at that point yet, but the direction of travel is unambiguous. And the limestone problem does not affect Hutchinson Island alone. It affects every beach in Florida, built on the same carbonate geology. Every barrier island, every stretch of critically eroded coastline, where the sand layer has thinned enough to allow saltwater regular access to the rock below. More than 500,000 Florida homeowners currently depend on Citizens Insurance, the state's insurer of last resort, because private insurers have already exited the coastal market. The insurance industry read the erosion data before the emergency declarations arrived. They ran the projections, they priced the risk, then they left. What remains is a state-backed system absorbing the liability of a coastline that the private market has already concluded is not insurable at sustainable rates. That is not a prediction about the future. That is the current condition of the Florida coastal insurance market in February 2026. And it raises a question that no emergency sand operation can answer. If the private insurance market has already exited, and the federal cost-benefit calculation excludes communities that do not meet its threshold, and the nourishment cycle keeps falling behind the erosion rate, what is the actual long-term plan for 500 miles of critically eroding Florida coastline? The answer, as of February 2026, is that there is not one. There are projects, there are emergency operations, there are federal applications and feasibility studies submitted in 2017 that are only now approaching approval. But there is no plan that closes the gap between the rate of erosion and the rate of response. And Hutchinson Island is not the exception on Florida's coast. It is the preview. Steve Tarr's house is 8 feet from the waterline on South Beach tonight. The federal project arrives March 9th. The ocean arrives every 6 hours. The insurance market has already made its assessment. The federal cost-benefit calculation has already returned its verdict. The limestone beneath the sand is already in contact with the saltwater. And the gap between what the data shows and what the systems designed to respond can actually deliver is the story of what is happening to Florida's coast right now. Not to one beach, not to one island, to more than 400 miles of critically eroded shoreline, losing ground faster than anyone predicted and faster than anyone is currently equipped to stop. The beach disappeared. The question now is what disappears with it.